Welcome back to Tushita Talks to the World. This morning I'm very happy to welcome as my guest Geoff Peterson, who I've known and worked with for a long period of time in the realms of both defence and executive education. Geoff was a senior military officer in the Australian Defence Force for over 3 decades, with much of that time focused on competing and sometimes cooperating with Cold War adversaries. He has a wide range of combat, intelligence, strategic analysis, representational, and whole-of-government experiences. These culminated with higher military education appointments to prepare public and military officials for effective strategic leadership. Geoff currently lives in Canberra, a city that I've had a fair bit to do with over the years, including first working with Geoff in Canberra in the Department of Defence during the last decade of the Cold War. That's what I'd like to start with today, because apart from us working together during the last decade of the Cold War, Geoff's also been thinking seriously and writing about, indeed, the concept of have we entered a new Cold War? Welcome, Geoff. Great to have you here. Thank you very much. Do you recall when we used to work together all of those years ago in Canberra?
I do. It was an exciting time, and it was lovely to meet up with you then, and it's lovely to talk with you again now. And we enjoyed those times, I think, back in the Strategic Analyst organisation, JIO, and then meeting again during that executive course for strategic leadership, where you actually assessed my master's thesis.
Yes, and made 100 points, didn't I? 110 points where you'd forgotten a full stop or something in the draft version. So the final version was excellent, of course. Yeah, JIO, for those who don't know, is the Joint Intelligence Organisation, part of the Department of Defence. They're an organisation that provides intelligence estimates and analysis, now called Defence Intelligence Organisation and still operating, which is where Geoff and I first met. Now, I was working on South Asia and Geoff was working on other areas, but we nevertheless, there weren't many of us, so we did get to know each other a little. And then at the Centre for Defence and Strategic Studies doing that particular teaching as well, which was fantastic. So getting back to the Cold War, what are your thoughts and memories of the Cold War, Geoff?
Well, I joined the Army in 1976 and went to Duntroon, which is the equivalent of Sandhurst in the UK or West Point in the US. And we were right in the middle of it. All our instructors were Vietnam War veterans, and there was a grudging respect for the potential adversary, the communists, that they, as they referred to them, they were tricky little buggers and hard fighters. So right from the outset, that sort of set our orientation. And right through the 80s, our training enemy was actually a Missourian adversary. It was a mixture of Soviet and Chinese tactics. And so we trained against those for combat and combat intelligence purposes. And then I had field research postings overseas with other nations, which gave me a sense of up close and personal with the potential adversary. And then I suppose the culmination of that was being back at JIO and doing the strategic analysis, and particularly in being part of a team that supported the Tiananmen massacre briefings, basically.
We might come back to Tiananmen in a little while. My recollection of the Cold War was slightly different from yours. I first went overseas in 1977 on the Trans-Siberian, and as a young Australian, went across Russia, which was the backbone of the Soviet Union. There were 15 republics, but it was the major one, and became intrigued by Russian society and politics, came back and did a degree in Russian, and then subsequently joined the Department of Defense. So sometimes people would ask me why I was studying Russian and whether I was a communist, of which I had to disavow them. I said, I'm terribly interested in Russian society. And then during, just after I joined JIO, perhaps in 1984, I think, we, the Australians, made, or the Australian government, I should say, made a Soviet diplomat persona non grata. And I had happened to know this gentleman. So I was very closely debriefed by our security people to make sure that I was, to use an Australianism, rigidage, which means true to what I told them previously. So it was a fascinating time, though. It was cutting edge, wasn't it? It was clearly them versus us.
Well, yes, they were, for us, they were the training adversary, and they were the most likely next opponent. And having had the Vietnam War experience, I think we certainly felt a degree of respect about their capacities.
So, given your area of expertise, which tended to be China, how did the Chinese find the Cold War? I know for the Russians, it was pretty clear who the enemy was, and they wanted, of course, to make the whole world communist, Soviet communist. I mean, not Chinese communist or Yugoslav communist, but Soviet communist. And it was a clear rivalry between their system and the so-called free world and democracy and that sort of thing. But China was a slightly different aspect of that equation. How did they find the Cold War?
Well, I think they saw it in a broader context, that they saw 2 centuries of humiliation. That was the mantra that was educated by the Chinese Communist Party to its people. They'd seen literal examples of that they weren't secure in their own nation. From their perspective, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. It's funny, initiative in competition between states ebbs and flows, and we saw the communist advancing. They saw themselves trying to secure their borders and feel more comfortable in their space. And it wasn't monolithic, because the Chinese were as worried about the Russians as they were about the United States. If you go to Beijing, not far outside of Beijing, you can find mountains hollowed out and huge caverns of where they had their fighter aircraft that were specifically built to defend Beijing against Russian Bear aircraft carrying nuclear weapons. So they felt that they were under threat as well, and they were pushing back. But they had in the late 60s and 70s, in places like Vietnam, they could see that they were also having some success. In 1990, I was back in Beijing just having a look to see if there would be any further tension as the anniversary of Tiananmen came up, and I had the opportunity to call in on the East German Defence Attaché, who greeted me very politely. We had a nice conversation. I asked him what did the future hold in store for him, and he said, well, in 3 weeks' time, I have to turn up the military headquarters in Bonn, and they will tell me my future. And I do not know what my future will be. And to me, that was a very, very practical example that the Cold War had concluded that phase. Ironically, he ended up turning up as the German butcher in Beijing, and he had a very profitable career doing that in the 90s.
Right, that's a real turnaround, isn't it? One of the major changes after the end of the Cold War, which perhaps was a little surprising, was the total demise of the communist ideology in Russia. But in China, they still call themselves communists, but they're no longer communists. So should we be surprised by that that they still call themselves communist, Geoff?
No. The Chinese Communist Party unified China in 1949. It's based its legitimacy on the ability to protect China, reunify China, make China strong again. So what advantage they had a leader, Deng Xiaoping, who was truly strategic in his orientation, and he made a couple of critical decisions which have benefited China and the Chinese Communist Party. And the first one was the one-child policy, which has its very dark side, but it did allow them to have more wealth for less people in terms of slowing the population growth. But that's been an important part of their improving the lifestyle of and life standards of the Chinese people. And the second thing, the most important thing, was that in regard to the economy, he said, I don't care if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. Yeah. But really what he was saying is that we will live with economic reform, but we won't live with the loss of political control. And in a sense, that's what Tiananmen was. It was demonstrating to their own people and to the world that the CCP would stay in charge and be in control, but the life standards of the Chinese people would be improved.
So CCP now stands for Chinese Communist Party or Chinese Capitalist Party?
Well, I actually, when I was a defence attaché in Beijing, I asked one of the academics, Chinese academics, about this, and his answer was, Geoff, it's like a glass of orange juice. You take a sip and you add some water. Over time, what does the orange juice become? It's not as strong, but we still call it orange juice.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good answer. So with the demise of communism in the Soviet Union, clearly, it was replaced by 15 separate republics, and it has now, of course, become what we're describing as an authoritarian system. It's got some of the remnants of the old system, certainly politically, maybe not ideologically. Whereas China also still calls itself communist, but we would also perhaps call it an authoritarian regime. And I see, as a result of their meetings in the last couple of days, Xi Jinping is now being called the core navigator and helmsman, which I think would be quite challenging, actually, to do both of those things together. It's okay when you're driving a car if you know where you're going, but if you're driving a car and you're trying to navigate at the same time, I've never mastered that technique, except now, of course, we have GPS, which makes it a bit easier. But the great rival was and remains the United States, which is where we're now coming into this second part of our discussion with you, Geoff, about this so-called second phase of Cold War competition. And I know you have been thinking a lot about this as a strategic thinker and analyst. And we just before we launch into that second phase, we tend to look at China and to some extent Russia in terms of what they're doing with this so-called hybrid warfare, using a whole different set of ways and means to try and challenge the West, particularly the United States, as sort of fairly monolithic and together powers. But in terms of Russia, they've got serious challenges. For example, their economy now is about a tenth of the size of the United States. They still have very powerful and potent military forces, nuclear weapons. They're a very large nation, but they're not terribly creative. They're not terribly innovative. They've got a very good and a very small defence community that's, in terms of technological innovation and development, is very sophisticated. But generally speaking, the economy is sluggish. Strategically, they're surrounded by all of these issues, thinking of Nagorno-Karabakh, the latest one, but also Georgia, Ukraine, not to mention Belarus. And of course, I think there's a little suspicion in the Russian mind about China in the Far East, and that China may try to regain some of those territories that were taken from China when it was weak, although economically they've already regained them. And then, of course, there's the rise of China, particularly in Central Asia. Now, in terms of China, we think of it as being really powerful. Its economy is growing. If you do PPP, purchasing price parity, it's about the same size or even larger than the United States economy. But what are some of the challenges that make China not as robust as perhaps some of us think it is?
Right. Just a couple of points. I would agree that China has evolved to being authoritarian, and that's not difficult for China. They've had an emperor for 6,000 years, so the concept of a hierarchy led by a supreme leader is not new to them. It's a change of style and term. In regard to China and Russia, I want to be clear that I don't see them as monolithic. I think their interests combine in seeing the United States power and influence reduced. So they have common interest, but I don't think they're necessarily acting in concert. Mm-hmm. And China does have a lot of challenges. It's a big nation with a lot of people and a lot of demands to meet. I think the greatest challenge for China is not dealing with adversity, because they know how to control quickly, and we've seen that during COVID. They can take controlling measures. They're used to that, and they're well placed structurally to do that. Mm-hmm. Coping with prosperity is another matter. Mm-hmm. As individuals get prosperous, they want to be involved in the decision making and in the political system. And that is difficult for the Chinese Communist Party. They're happy to see economic reform. They all benefit from that, but they want political control. So how do you have people with more wealth and more influence, but still no political influence? So I think that's a big problem for them. I think the foundations of their financial strength are probably shaky, but I don't know enough about finance to understand how they would go as a leader in that space in global terms. And I still think they have an unattractive ideology, but that's possibly my bias.
Possibly, yeah. So in a piece, Geoff, that you've just written titled The Cold War, the Second Phase, or it's actually called The Second Phase, you say that authoritarian China and Russia, somewhat humbled by their negative Cold War experiences, have actually learnt from these experiences and their failures during the Cold War. You argue that they've commenced a second Cold War competition that is seriously damaging liberal democracies such as Australia, the United States, and various others around. So I'm curious to know when and why you started to formulate this particular idea.
I suppose the way I think about statecraft was really confirmed for me during the 1989 Tiananmen incident, when we were doing briefings on it. And I really felt that you have to look at the patterns of what's evolving and try and piece it together. And you tend to look in terms of capability, intent, and motivation. Capability tells you what a nation can do. Intent gives you an insight into how and when they might do it. And motivation talks about why. What is the size of the prize? And therefore it gives you an indication of the risks they're willing to bear to achieve that prize. So when I looked at the 2016 US election and the talk about Russian interference, I sort of went to why. What's in it for them? Mm. And then I went backwards from the motivation through why have they done it now, and what capacity do they have to do it? And I think there's quite a period of examples of interference by both China and Russia in new domains, not the traditional military, economic, and even political domains, but in the domains of information, truth and trust, strategic leadership and strategic maneuver, which indicate that they have been testing out their capability with a view to reducing US and liberal democracy influence regionally and globally. Mm-hmm. And why would they do that? So that they can feel more secure. And why are they motivated to do that? because they were defeated in 1989. It was humiliating. They had to work out why they lost. They had to learn new lessons, and they had to find new ways and means to compete with the United States and the liberal democracies if they were going to feel secure and see their nations be great again.
Mm. So what are some of the new ways then, some of them innovative, of course, including, because in the 1990s, we didn't have computing technology the way we do now, but what are some of these new innovative ways and means in which, or with which, China and Russia are competing or trying to weaken or destabilise the liberal democracies?
Well, ironically, I think the first lesson that they learned was that they lost the first phase of Cold War competition because they lost unity of purpose in their leadership and with their people. And I think the first new grey zone domain that I would call it is in regard to information, truth and trust. Now, ironically, communist nations have always had an advantage in misinformation, disinformation. What I think they are doing are using a whole succession of disruptive ideas to cause dissent, sow confusion, and have debate inside liberal democracy societies. Why is that significant? If there is no public mandate in liberal democracies, then that denies the basis for our leaders to come up with a clear strategic trajectory or clear policy responses to the actions of others. So I think they have really used disruptive ideas, and they've used an adaptation of military swarming tactics that they just insert the idea into our information arteries and let it flow. Some of those ideas are bizarre and they wither and die. Others find a host, gain attraction, they mutate, and in fact there are even legitimate areas of our society that takes that idea for their own purpose and promotes it and protects it. And the impact is not in the message, but in the subsurface effect, which is to cause dissent internally so that there's no social consensus, so that we can't take action against it. And countries that believe in the contest of ideas are really poorly placed to actually deal with ideas that disrupt. So it's very effective. It's low management, low cost, and deniable. And the beauty about deniability is that we see no danger to deal with it. So they get free run. And you might say, well, how effective is that? Have a look at Brexit. I'm not saying they came up with the idea, but certainly there's evidence that they helped promote it. And look at the dissension that that's caused.
Yeah.
And some of the comments in the United States around the denigration of the very institutions the United States set up post-World War II to run a rules-based global order, they've stepped away from. And some of their public leaders have publicly denigrated their intelligence institutions, their political institutions, their voting, a whole range of things, and supported conspiracy theorist organisations like QAnon. Now, you couldn't force our leaders to do that, but the insertion of ideas has had that effect, and it's all deniable. So that's the first area. I think the second area is stable leadership. They have suffered from unstable leadership. They saw the demise in their own country, and they saw what that did to unity of purpose. And they've made unity of purpose a target in liberal democracies. And they have a systemic advantage. They have two leaders in Putin and Xi Jinping, who are leaders effectively for life, and systems based around them. Whereas we have systems which we've had a succession of weakly mandated leaders, and it's very hard to establish a long-term strategic trajectory there. And I think the advantage is that they don't have to outperform our leaders; they just have to outlast them, which is all in our electoral. It's all in our electoral cycle. So that's a problem for us. And I think that then leads into strategic manoeuvre. And I think liberal democracies and the Russians prefer kinetic competition and a win-lose situation, more like a game of chess. Somebody wins. And I think particularly with the Chinese, they prefer a more strategic approach. They don't have to win every contest. They just have to come out more strongly placed than the United States. So I think they've been doing a lot of strategic manoeuvre, which really has been based around initiatives to separate people from or countries from the US orbit. And a good example is a country like the Philippines, where essentially over 3 decades, that country has gone from a close ally of the United States, hosting significant US forces, to a strategic neutral that publicly will not take on the Chinese in the South China Sea because they're stronger. And in a sense, that's provided a new model to compare with the US hub and spoke model. And strategic neutrality, that's just one place, Philippines. It's very important in terms of the second island chain and the approaches to China and also to Japan and Korea and to Taiwan. But in the game of Go, you would then be working on Thailand and probably a country such as the Singapore to also see if you could encourage strategic neutrality there. That would then isolate Taiwan, and when you can rejoin Taiwan, that would then put South Korea and Japan between a Russian hammer and a Chinese anvil. So in terms of strategic manoeuvre, I think a lot of the work that they're doing around the world is seemingly benign, but it provides opportunities to degrade US power and position them to be more influential in the world.
So a couple of paradoxes there, aren't there? The one about authoritarian leadership and us not having it. It's not something that we really want, but we need to develop some sort of continuity or bipartisan support, I suppose, for policies might be one way around it. But the other one, the leadership for life. Clearly, though, I think the Chinese and the Russians have learnt nothing from the Cold War, because I think that's one of the reasons why Russia failed. Because of Chernenko, Brezhnev and Andropov, they were just too old and ultimately senile, and that's a factor. But there are other issues. But do you think the West is losing this war? And if it does lose this war, what are the ramifications of that?
I talk about a coming phase, the second phase of a coming Cold War. So it's not as formative as we're in a clear war now, but I think the patterns are starting to emerge, and that if we do not start to talk to our own public about the significance of that and the consequence of it, you won't build a public mandate to build effective policy responses. So I wouldn't want to call it too early in terms of that it's all here facing us now, but I think we can see plenty of examples. And the interference in our political system is a good example of how they have not gone back to the old economic, military, political direct challenge. They're not strong enough yet. They have found other ways to disrupt us. And why would they do that? That's what was done to them. So they have learnt that lesson. And I think if they continue to have success with it, then they will be encouraged to do it further. If you, I suppose, start the discussion now and send the signals now, that we're aware of what's going on, that may have an impact on them. But more importantly, we need to start the discussion with our own people about, is this happening? And what does it mean? And how do we counter it? And I think the most important thing is a sort of a social contract where the people understand that this is happening, and social consensus is important for us to stay effective and strong. And that's the best way to further our interests. So in a sense, whilst the challenge might be coming from outside, the response is actually inside. If we strengthen ourselves through a common understanding and give our leaders a mandate to develop effective policy response, that is our best protection, and that is in our hands. And in a sense, I don't want to draw the analogy too much, but if you look at the liberal democracies in the 20s and 30s, their failure to deal with the world that was evolving in the face of some growing authoritarian regimes looks a little similar. Actually realise there's an issue, and do we realise that part of the solution is in our hands?
It's now that I reveal something that many people who know you know about you, but not the people who are watching this may not. And that is that in terms of Australian rules football, this great game that's really only played in Australia, you are actually a very partisan and strong Hawthorn supporter, hence the mug that you have very astutely put to your lips. Very good. Thank you. Now, the coach of that very successful football team, unfortunately very successful in my opinion, because I'm clearly not a Hawks supporter, is a guy called Alistair Clarkson, who has said, you've sort of paraphrased this and used this as part of your argument, that liberal democracy is like a shark. It needs to keep moving forward to survive. If you can make it stand still, it will begin to die. So that's part of our challenge as well, I guess. So how do you think we're faring, these liberal democracies? Are we in danger of dying, or, are we going to hang in there?
I would probably ask our listeners, and I'm sure you have many of them, how do they think we're faring?
Yeah.
I would say that in Chinese society and Russian society, there are probably a lot of detractors from their leaders, but they feel that their life in general is getting better, and that their country, their state, is doing well globally vis-a-vis the liberal democracies. And I think they would look at the example of some of our leaders and go, they're in trouble. They have no unity of purpose, and their ability to deal with serious challenges doesn't seem as strong as it was in the past. So this is where in the essay, I'm talking about strategic trajectory, and I'm not talking about in the next 10 years. This may take till 2050 to occur if we don't do something about it. That's why I think there is time to address these competitive aspects, and there's time to find more cooperative aspects, because really, particularly economically and politically, there's benefits for China and Russia to work with us, and vice versa. So we have an opportunity to turn this around, but I think we have to understand at the moment we are in a phase of competition, and we actually have to do some homework and work with our own people to get better policy responses in this area.
Yeah. Geoff, thank you very much. I always enjoy talking to you, and I also enjoy reminiscing about the Cold War. It was very clear who the opponent was in the Cold War. This new second phase of it is a little bit more amorphous. But I do have one last question for you. Do you know why your East German, who then became a German butcher, what was he, military attaché, then went back to Beijing as a butcher? Do you know why he did that? I can give you the answer.
Well,
no. Do you know what the answer? Let me give you.
He lost his country.
He lost his country. I can tell you the answer, because he got the chop. Sorry. And with that, I conclude. So thank you very much, Geoff. Great to talk to you, and thank you very much for your very thoughtful insights. Terrific.
Thanks, Chris. Lovely to talk to you.
Thanks, Geoff.
Go Hawks.